Our speaker this evening, Dr. Garth Spellman, grew up in Fargo, North Dakota, with a passion for biodiversity science. He received his bachelor's degree in biology from Carleton College, his master's from the University of Alaska, and his doctorate from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. During and after his academic studies, Dr. Spellman held various research and teaching assistantships and managed DNA lab and genetics collections at UNLV's Barrick Museum of Natural History. Dr. Spellman was a research professor at Black Hills State University for 7 years, followed by his becoming a program director in environmental biology at the National Science Foundation. Since 2015, he's been curator of ornithology at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, and also an affiliate faculty member of the University of Colorado's Department of Integrative Biology. His research interests focus on how recent and ancient environmental changes have affected bird species, as bird species constantly evolve in response to environmental change. We're pleased to have Garth speak to us tonight on Have You Ever Thought About Birds' Ears? Evolution of the Avian Inner Ear. Garth?
Thank you, Bill. That was a great introduction, and thank you so much to everyone out there for attending tonight. It's hard to believe we have 150 people connected, and luckily multiple people at some of those places. So thank you so much for coming out tonight. I really appreciate it. Before I start showing my screen, I do just want to forewarn people. I do have 3 young boys from middle school down to 2nd grade, and they get punchy at night. So you might hear people jumping up and down. You may hear some shouting out in the hallway, and I apologize for that. It's just normal. It's what happens around the household. And if they're harassing my dog, he'll probably come and knock on the door of the study here. So just if there are any distractions, just want to let you know I'm sorry ahead of time. All right, so I'll start sharing my screen here. And I'm really happy you asked me here today. About a year ago, when I was asked to present, I thought I was going to give a talk about a field trip I had planned. So last May and June, I was supposed to travel to China for a couple of months and study some avian, some bird hybrid zones out in far western China. We all know how that turned out. Pandemic kind of shut that down. And it doesn't look like we're going to be able to get out there to do that even this year. And so I've had other projects that I've been working on for a while that kind of came to the forefront as a result of that. And one is the project I'm going to talk to you about today. And it's really about, we're going to focus on the first 2 manuscripts that have come out for this research. And it is about bird hearing. I would love to get into the evolutionary ecology of bird ears tonight, but you're going to have me back in 2 years when we have that figured out, because the first steps in this project are baby steps. They're fun and they're interesting results, but to figure out the true evolution of the avian middle and inner ear, everyone's going to have to stay tuned, going to have to come back and talk more about that. I'd like to thank my co-authors on this work, John Peacock, Nathaniel Green, and Daniel Tolland. They are all at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus, and they work in an otolaryngology lab. So it's nice to have really smart people here in Denver to help with this type of work. So as we all know, as birders, as citizen scientists, communication is essential to bird survival and success. They use it to help defend territories, to find mates, for socialization, bee eaters that flock in large groups, and even as alarm calls to warn the same species and also other species about potential predators that might be in their environment. Communication is essential to these birds. And I know as myself as an ornithologist, for the longest time, I appreciated birdsong and its role in ornithology and in the lives of birds. But I always really sort of thought of it from the producer of the sound, the producer's perspective, the speaker rather than the receiver. And it's probably because when we look at birds, it's really hard to see their ears. They're not very prominent. So we see this jackrabbit here and it's obvious. We wonder what those ears are used for. But birds that you see on the left of my screen over here, like this warbler, so a bird's ears are hidden by the auricular feathers, these feather patches that are specially designed to cover that ear opening that is just below the eye and past the bill. Now, other birds make it a little more prominent, like the cockatiel. They have particular colored ear patches, so those are the ear feathers. But like this cockatoo, we never see, birds with these large pinnae that we see in mammals. And so we may not even think about them necessarily as much as receivers. And this is very much reflected in the scientific literature. If we just do a quick Web of Science search, this is a journal aggregator, we see in the last 100 years, there have been 255,000 articles, scientific articles, written on birdsong. There have only been under 15,000 articles written on bird hearing or ears. And in many of these instances, those articles are talking about it in the context of other vertebrates and not just focusing on the bird ears themselves. And I feel guilty of this as an ornithologist and not focusing on it. It might be that it's harder research, but it was really something that piqued my interest when my father, this is Stephen Spellman right here, he's at Cheyenne National Grassland, which is outside of Fargo, North Dakota, where he lives. And about 15 years ago, he started to lose his hearing. And it's been pretty extreme since he started, that he now has very extreme hearing loss and has powerful hearing aids to help him hear. But while he was birding, he started to lose those high frequencies first. And I have a picture right here of a downy woodpecker because that's his favorite bird. As a resident of North Dakota, he knows he can always see them. And it's one of the few birds that he can hear now. And it has to do with the bird's hammering and not so much its chatter anymore, because he's lost those high-pitched frequency sounds. He can no longer hear them. I also started to think about bird ears because of my PhD advisor. This is Dr. John Klicka. He's now the curator of birds at the Burke Museum of Natural History at the University of Washington in Seattle. And we've done lots of projects together, but one in particular we worked on is we've written several papers on the evolution of brown creepers in North America. And when I first joined his lab, I had no idea that he couldn't hear these guys. And I learned eventually, going out into the field with him, that he was unable to hear brown creepers and relied only on sight to see them, and learned about their history and the reason why. His first job was as a bouncer and then a manager of First Avenue, which is a pretty famous concert venue, small concert venue in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And so prior to him becoming an ornithologist for nearly a decade, he worked in First Avenue, and he was actually one of the managers there when they filmed Prince's Purple Rain. And his ex-wife, his first wife, is in fact in the film Purple Rain. So he was there throughout this period, and he, because of that exposure to loud noise, he lost his high frequency pitch hearing, and he can't hear birdsong very well. So as an ornithologist and studying this little critter, a brown creeper, which, as we all know, only makes extremely hot, soft, high-pitched sounds, he has done several research projects on a bird he can't hear. And so this exposure got me thinking, and eventually 3 years ago, I met this man. This is John Peacock. He has no research pictures of himself, but he likes to act outside. So I took a picture from a theater that he was acting in. But John Peacock is a Scottish researcher, postdoc, who's at CU Anschutz. And 3 years ago, he came to the museum wanting to know if there was any chance that he could get his hands on birds to study their ears, because he worked in an otolaryngology lab. He loved birds. His study organism at the time was chinchillas, because they have ears, structures, and a frequency hearing range very similar to humans. So they're good models for human ears. But his passion was really with birds and wanting to learn about bird ears. And so we started to work together. And so a lot of my reasoning was because of hearing loss. And we think about things that cause hearing loss in humans, and we also know in our dogs, but loud noise and decibel level is certainly one, like John with persistent and loud music. Blast noise from gunshots. So hunters often experience hearing loss later on in life, as well with soldiers. And that can be due to noise damage of the eardrum, but it also affects the structures of the middle and the inner ear. Blast damage, which generally affects the middle ear, and this is opposed to blast noise. This is due to an overpressurization that occurs because of the blast force hitting the eardrum and causing damage to the middle ear. In some extreme cases, you can even break the bones that are part of that mechanism in your ear. Other pressure changes, atmospheric changes that are frequent and profound. Some professional divers, deep sea divers, experience loss of hearing as a result of damage to their eardrum and their middle and inner ear. Infections, and then genetics. And it's possible that I may experience similar hearing loss to my father later on in life as a result of that. So these are reasons why I really am interested in birds, because we can ask the question simply, do birds lose their hearing? And this is one of the things that we know they don't over time. And that means that the structures of their middle and inner ear are robust to damage, to infection, and other things. And so by studying birds and their hearing, we may be able to find clues to prevent hearing loss potentially later for humans in the future. And we also know that birds, their inner ear, the cochlear hair cells, they regenerate throughout their lives. Unlike in mammals, where if they become damaged, especially severely damaged, that damage will not be repaired, and that hearing is lost permanently, but not in birds. And we also know that birds actually, if we think about the things that cause hearing loss, they have extreme lifestyles that might actually, you think, potentially lead to hearing loss or damage to that inner ear. And so how do they really prevent that from happening, or how can they cope? And this is in many cases. We know lots of birds that have extreme lifestyles. We know that kingfishers, it has been studied, the impact when they hit the water can be as loud as nearly sometimes potentially a sonic boom. But we also know that the shape of their bill and the shape of their head reduces some of that pressurization that occurs around the head. But still, we know the ear is experiencing a tremendous amount of pressure under these circumstances. The same can be said with gannets, northern gannets. And they dive from even higher perches than most kingfishers, and with an extreme force. If humans hit the water at the rate at which they hit the water, we would easily snap our necks. And this it's been measured, has an extreme pressure change that occurs within the bird's middle and inner ear. So how do the structures of their ear allow them to have that lifestyle? We, around here, at least in Colorado, we've all heard this. And if you're in my neighborhood, you've heard what happens next. So birds have extreme lifestyles that can affect their hearing, more so in many cases than most mammals, and also than what most humans might experience. Now, we do know a ton about the neurobiology of bird communication and other facets of hearing. We understand what signals are going on within the brain when a bird hears. But what we don't really understand are the mechanistic underpinnings of bird ears. We also know a lot about the function of hearing within birds and how they use it within their environments. We know that barn owls, in fact, use hearing in the dark in order to pinpoint the location of rodents on the ground. So the horizontal plane is gained by them turning their facial disc towards a low-pitched sound they hear. And that allows them to calculate the distance between their left and their right ears. But they figure out on the vertical plane where their prey is because their ears are offset. So the right ear is generally lower than the left ear. And so sound is hitting those ears at different rates, and they're able to make those or process that within their brain to figure out where exactly in that vertical plane their prey is. So you could see the skull of a barn owl here. It's drawn a little bit more pronounced than it really is in real life, but the ear openings are offset to allow for that pinpointing of the vertical location of their prey. And so we know a lot about function. We know a lot about the neurobiology, but what we don't understand is how the middle and inner ears function very well within birds. And that's due to a lack of attention on these structures. So in the middle and on the right here, you have a picture of a human ear. And so you've got the external pinnae, you have the eardrum right here. The middle ear is comprised of 3 bones. So the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. In a bird, the middle ear is actually composed of just one, a single bone. It's this one right here, the structure number 11 in A. And that is a bone that is called the columellae. It really is analogous to the stapes within a mammal, a mammalian ear, but it's just a single bony structure. Then what you have outside of that, this ligament structure on the outside, that is called the extracolumellae, and that is all attached to the tympanic membrane out here on a bird. So it's quite different, But then the inner ear is similar. You've got a cavernous and also multi-tubed cochlea. But in birds, as I said before, we know that the hair cells in that cochlea actually regenerate themselves over time throughout the bird's life. But we really don't understand the transfer of acoustic energy into mechanical energy and then into what we would call hydraulic energy within the inner ear. We don't understand how energy is transferred across that ear. And we also don't understand how the shape and structure of the middle ear can affect how energy gets transferred across and into the inner ear of a bird. And so this is what John Peacock and I set out to sort of answer. Well, could we look at a lot of different species and study the structures of the middle ear and how differences in those structures can then affect energy transfer into the inner ear? And so that's where our research took us. And so that middle ear has many functions. One is conduction. Of course, it's conducting sound from the outer ear to the inner ear. It also protects the structures of that inner ear in the middle ear. So it creates a barrier. And the muscles of the middle ear may also help protect from loud sounds potentially. It functions as a transducer. It's converting acoustic energy into mechanical energy, and then converting mechanical energy into that hydraulic energy. And it functions as an amplifier, so a transformer. And it really is transforming only about 1/30 of the acoustic energy is transferred into that inner ear. Otherwise, if it was transferring more of that decibel level, it would continually damage the soft structures of that inner ear. So we're glad that it's doing that. And so I'm going to talk about the two papers that we first published this year. They were featured on the cover of a journal, Hearing Research. This is an Elsevier journal. And they were companion papers that we wrote for this journal this year. And they studied the comparative anatomy and really the comparative mechanics of the avian middle ear. And I'm going to start with this scaling paper of the avian middle ear. And because very little has been studied about this, we don't even know how the structures scale with one another and how that can potentially have an effect on how these structures function. And so these were really the first studies that we were doing. And we focused heavily on this bony columella, the one bone that is found within a bird ear. And so this is what one of those, just a generic one, kind of looks like. So the distal process, this is the part that connects to the extra columella and then the eardrum. That's what this side of the bone would be in B. On the other side, you have a foot plate, and it's generally round or elliptical. Sometimes it has a disc that protrudes into the inner ear. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it has holes in it. That's what we would call this basal fossae. And then it has a neck and a shaft. And the shaft and the neck, they can twist. They can have additional structures that are part of them. But we sought out to sort of describe variation we might find within these bones and their relation to other structures of the middle ear. And so this had been done really by only a couple of other people in the past, one of which was this man right here, Alan Fiducia. He had an obsession, I didn't know this before I got in, but had an obsession with the bony columella of birds. And he wrote probably 27 papers about the bony columella. And Alan Fiducia is very famous for putting forward and pressing against the theory that birds evolved from dinosaurs. He really didn't believe that. And in a way, he kind of actually made other people make sure that their research was top notch to actually prove that and support that hypothesis. But he also had this other obsession, the bony stapes or bony columella of birds. And so if you look through all of his literature, he has a couple of pictures of these columellae in his publications, but he never describes any measurements or really any observations that are quantified within his publications. He just looks at them and is making guesses about relationships between birds. And so his papers turned out to be very unhelpful when doing this kind of work. One of the things he did suggest, though, was he studied this shoebill stork, and he proposed that in fact it was related to storks because of the shape of its bony columella. And it turns out that was one thing that he was wrong about. So in fact is in the order Pelecaniformes and is more closely related to pelicans, which just goes to show you that these bony structures of a bird's ear could be susceptible to convergent evolution. So meaning that the structures are similar to one another in unrelated taxa, possibly due to their ecology, feeding behavior, or maybe even the sounds that they use in their environment as cues. And this is one of the things that we are trying to get at eventually with the research that we're doing. So what did we do? Well, we got at the museum. I'm lucky to work at a museum because we have lots of salvage birds that are brought into us, some that come to us from partner institutions such as the zoo, which help us increase our diversity that we get and taxonomic representation. But I have access to a lot of birds that are frozen in really good condition. And so we can use these. A lot of hearing research is done on, or in humans, is done on cadavers to understand the impact of blast sounds and other things on human hearing. And so we can do the same in birds. I did not know this until I met John from CU Anschutz, that we could in fact do this. So one of the things we did was get as many species as we can and get into their inner and middle ears. And after we did our mechanistic measurements, which I'll talk about later, we would dissect out their bony columella and look at it and measure it and weigh it and study the structures. So we've got all sorts of different ones. This really long one here with holes throughout the shaft and an extremely broad distal end. This is the bony columella of an American white pelican right there. It's about 5 millimeters long. This number 11 right here, this is that African shoebill that I showed you in the previous picture. Some other strange ones are this 1A and 1B. These are the bony columellae that you find from a barn owl. And they have this foot plate, this bulbous foot plate that sticks into the inner ear. And in some cases, it's symmetrical. And in other cases, that bulb is asymmetrical. And it changes between the ears of the owls themselves. And we have yet to figure out exactly why, but it's one of the curiosities as you study these of what those things look like. Number 28 down here, this is the bony columellae of a hairy woodpecker. It's extremely small and very, very thick compared to others of its size. And so how does that affect the function of it? So once we add these bony columellae, And we studied them from a total of 49 different species. And we chose them to be as taxonomically and ecologically diverse as we possibly could get them. And we included samples from 23 orders that represented 34 families and 47 genera of birds. It includes flying, diving, and flightless birds, and a variety of birds that are exploiting different ecological niches. As I mentioned before, from pelicans to woodpeckers to finches and ostriches. And so what we did from each of these species is we measured the columella length, columella mass, the interoral diameter, so that is the distance between the bird's ears and their skull, the tympanic membrane area, so this is the area on the outside of the bird ear underneath those auricular feathers, and the columellae foot plate area, so that's this end that goes to the inner ear, and extracolumella length. And what we were looking at were relationships and shared properties between these different structures to see if there was a relationship between them. And that's because in mammals and in other groups of vertebrates that have been studied, their ears have been studied, they showed these scaling relationships. And that just means that as a bird gets bigger and its head gets larger, that the structures scale with that. And that's one of the properties that we have to account for in order to explain how these structures evolve and how they relate to ecology later on as this project evolves and grows as well. And so that was really what our first paper was about, is just how do these structures relate to one another. And so what we found was what we had expected, in that scaling was something that we saw within these structures. So this B figure right here, this is just showing the relationship between the mass of that columella and the length of that columella. You would expect that as a columella grows longer, that the mass would increase. And it does. It's a logarithmic scale, so that's why these axes look a little funny, just to show that relationship. And we see a very tight relationship, but we do see some exceptions, things that sort of fall off this very tight line of data. One is the American white pelican. And the pelican has an extremely long columella for its weight. And that's what happened. All those little holes in that tiny bone cause it to not weigh as much as you might expect given its length. And it has to do, we believe, with the scaling of that pelican's head, and also potentially due to that bird's ecology and how it feeds, and how the jaw and skull really have quite a bit of expansion that can occur within that bird. So we feel that that might explain it. And we also see another curious bird, this CNH right here, that refers to a common nighthawk. And so nighthawks belong to Caprimulgriformes. This is the order that you find for nighthawks and frogmouths. And if you look at these birds, you know, they're essentially aerial vacuums as they fly around with their mouths wide open and their gaping mouths catching insects. And if you look at their skulls look like they've been laterally compressed, just squished and pushed out. And so nighthawks and frogmouths also have extremely long columellae, and you might expect them to weigh a little bit more, but they don't. So their length has grown faster than the mass has grown. And these are two of the kind of outliers that we see. And we think what we're seeing now is some of that evolutionary ecology come into play, that as long as it's not having a significant impact on hearing capability, these structures can evolve quite profoundly. And so there's also potentially some other things going on with other species, but these are some of the patterns that just jumped out when we were looking at this particular scaling project. We also looked at how the footplate of the columellae, so the end that's in the inner ear, scales with relationship to the tympanic membrane, that external portion. And always, in every case, the tympanic membrane is much bigger than the footplate of the columellae. But what we do find is a nice positive relationship. Just it's driven by different ratios. So there are some cases where the tympanic membrane is 20 to 30, right, times the area of the footplate. Some cases where it's 30 to 40 times that. And so we look at those ratios and we see the differences there. But generally, as a head gets bigger, the tympanic membrane grows at about the same rate that we see as the footplate area. So these are again good patterns that we had hoped to see, and will allow us to ask more questions about the ecology and evolution of these structures as the research progresses. So the next thing that we looked into was a comparative study of the mechanics. So now that we understand something of the scaling, we need to understand how that middle ear is converting acoustic energy into mechanical energy, and then eventually into hydraulic energy that is used to sense what sounds are being heard. And so we did this with the cadavers. So you can imagine some of these birds, our finches were, only 5-6 grams, so not very big. And so we're working with very small instrumentation. And so this is a schematic of what we did. We have a speaker that is put into the bird's ear. So the cavity, take the feathers away and we put the speaker in, and then a probe microphone. That microphone is just telling us that the sounds that are produced from that speaker are at the right frequency and the right decibel that we want them to be. And so we put these into the bird's ear. And then on the other side, we dissect into the cadaver's head, and we put a laser vibrometer on the other side. Of course, it's not the scale. It's not quite that big. It's tiny, and we can measure the transfer of energy from acoustic energy into mechanical energy that is coming on that other side. And what we do is we play sounds at a range of frequencies, so from very low pitched to high pitched, and then we change the decibel levels, 3 different decibel levels from sort of soft to loud, to see how that affects frequency and transfer. And so what we get it's something that's called an energy transfer curve. So, and it kind of looks like this, where A here, this would be the peak of energy transfer. So that means that's where the most energy is getting transferred at a particular frequency. In this case, this is for all the birds that we studied. In this case, we've zeroed them all, and we just are showing the octave, so the frequency. So if you're at C, right, middle C, if you go up to the next octave above that, right, that is showing how energy is transferred. And generally, once you're at the peak, as you move octaves on either side of that peak, the amount of energy transferred is going to get lower, because there's a frequency that particular ear structure is perfected for. at that peak, and that's what we would call the peak of energy transfer. And so this is just showing in every single bird that we have how the frequency or the energy transfer and columella velocity on that other side, it gets a lot noisier as you get to the high frequency ranges than it does at the low frequency ranges. And that is what we see in humans as well and other mammals. But we are able to measure all of these frequencies across there. What this data on the right here is just showing is the peak frequency from every single species at different decibel levels. So we did sound at 3 decibels, 6 decibels, and 10 decibels. And what it is showing is that there's a very nice linear relationship among all of the samples, the species that we looked at each level. But what you can see is as you get louder at 10 decibels, you can see that the noise and the variation gets greater. So, and that's just what we see in humans as well. As sounds get louder, right? Those frequencies that are peak frequencies can fluctuate more. And so this is what we had expected, and it's good. And so we wanted to study, you know, what this looks like. And one thing that we need to know is, are these energy transfer curves, are they actually measuring bird hearing? And there are very few birds that actually have audiograms registered for them. And that's because it's really hard to figure out how a bird brain is reacting to sound. So not many species have been studied. But these are the ones that we could find in the scientific literature. And blue is actually our energy transfer curves across the middle ear, and red on each of these curves are showing audiograms. So that is the brain's sensitivity to sounds, excuse me, of different frequencies. And so for each of these, what we show is that our peak energy transfer across the middle ear shows a very good relationship to what is known as the peak of sensitivity in these audiograms. So we're actually measuring hearing pretty well by studying the middle ear and how energy gets transferred across that middle ear. And that just means that as we study more and more species, we know that our data is a reflection of hearing and what they're hearing in their environment. So this is all the energy transfer curves for all the birds that we measured. And I don't want you to get a headache looking at it, but essentially what you can imagine is as you move from the top left down to the bottom right, we're starting to get into smaller birds in general. And in smaller birds, what we should see is we should see the peak of these curves shifting to the right, meaning that they are finer tuned for higher frequency sounds, or better tuned to higher frequency sounds. And that's because these birds are generally producing so higher frequency sounds, and also the structures of their inner ear are much smaller, because as you scale down to smaller size, you would expect them to be hearing better at higher frequencies. And that is what we see across the board. There's a little bit of noise in it, but we do see that. And so then once we get all the mechanics and we show how energy is transferred across the middle ear, we can relate it to scaling and what we saw in the previous study. And so what we see is that a bird's hearing and frequency of what it's hearing is actually related and significantly related to the shape and heft of the columella. In fact, we can explain almost 50% of the variation of what a bird hears just by knowing what the length of its middle ear bone is. Now, that's not everything, but it's a lot when you look at some of these other relationships, and especially if you've ever studied ecology before, that's a lot of variation that you can explain by getting one thing. And it also tells us that as we start to study finer structures of these bones, of how they're bent, how they're twisted, we can start to study more fine scale evolutionary pressures on these structures. So as we put it all together, really the take-home messages, I know this is just in the beginning. I wanted to answer all the questions about how bird hearing evolved, and we'll get there. We're getting there. But one of the things, I mean, if you go home tonight, you just need to know, as their heads get wider and bigger, the inner ear bones grow in length. Mass does as well, but a little bit less so. Energy transfer across the middle ear, it mimics a bird's capability to hear those audiograms. And columella length actually explains a significant amount of variation in energy transfer. So meaning we can understand bird hearing by studying these middle ear bones. It can teach us a lot. And so our next directions that we're going, the first is the great columella caper, I call it. We have now inner or middle ear bones from about 200 to 250 different species that we've been able to take out of old museum skeletons. We are now scanning, using a scanning electron microscope to image these structures so that we can understand so little details, fine details about them. And eventually we hope to study how that middle ear morphology correlates with ecology behavior and how these structures evolve among species, within groups, and how that affects hearing. And so that's where this research is coming from now. As we get all these structures, we're drawing figures of them so someone else can come and study them eventually, unlike Fiducia's work where you can't really do much with it. So we're hoping that all these images can be made available and in fine detail, and we can do this in our museum database, which is nice. And then we are also now working on using a technique called optical coherence tomography of the middle ear. If you've ever been to an optometrist and they've taken an OCT image of your retina, this is how you kind of map the retina. It is now being used in studies and in diagnosis of human hearing loss and conditions. And it can be used to study the inner ear. So unlike the methods we've been using before by just using laser vibrometers, in using this method, we can actually pinpoint within the middle ear exactly what's going on with the extra columellae and the columellae to figure out exactly where energy is being transferred across those structures and how it moves through that middle ear in these birds. And so that is where we're going in the future. And we really hope to tie this all together to understand and create a model for bird hearing that can help us understand if a bird has a particular ecological niche. We can begin to unravel what the structures of its middle ear will look like, what it hears, what its soundscape is. And we are hoping that it can also be used to not only understand bird hearing, but how bird hearing doesn't diminish throughout their lifespan and over time, and whether or not that could potentially lead to breakthroughs in the understanding and hopefully healing of hearing loss in humans. And we're also using this work to reconstruct what extinct animals related to birds might have heard. So we can actually use CT scans to study the columellae and heft of extinct dinosaurs like a T-Rex. And by using the models that we've constructed from this work, we could figure out what was it that a T-Rex heard, if anything. And so with that, I would be happy to take questions, and I would love to hear from everyone who's out there.
Thank you very much, Garth, for your talk. Yes, we've had some questions come in. One is those very different foot plates of the barn owl. Were those in the same individual or two different individuals?
That's the amazing thing, is from a single individual, if you pull the left ear and the right ear, they can be profoundly different. And that is, some of them, that bulbous foot plate, it can be very symmetrical. So it looks like a bowl, a breakfast cereal bowl. And in the case of the one that I showed in the image, it's asymmetric, it's offset. And that can occur in the right and left ear of individuals. We've taken the columella out of about 25 barn owls now, and there's no rhyme or reason to it. It's not as if the left of an individual and the right of an individual have a consistent morphology. The only thing consistent is that they have that bulb. Okay. And so that's actually one of the papers we're working on right now, is we're writing up how that affects the mechanics of it.
Okay. And how can you know if the studies in birds' cadavers actually translate to the live birds? Could the freezing process change the mechanics?
So we know, we have really good evidence for that from the audiogram data. The audiograms were done in live birds, and that shows the frequency that a bird can hear as its sensitivity, its brain sensitivity. So they're reading the brain waves as how they're receptive to that sound. And our transfer functions are very, very similar to that. So we know the range of frequencies the birds are receiving from the middle ear are being transferred effectively. So across there. You're muted again, Bill, sorry.
Did you see any specific pathology in those bones you looked at?
A lot of these birds, of course, come to us from rescue centers and other things, and we don't see pathology in their ears, but we do see a lot of pathology in their skeletons from other things that happened in their lives. But we don't see anything in particular in the middle ear and inner ear. They're all really pretty pristine.
Bill, you're muted again.
Okay. Aside from the pelican, is the columella structurally similar to other hollow bird bones, or are they solid to better transmit sound?
That's a really interesting question, because some of the birds have quite solid columellae. I mean, they're so tiny and so delicate in some of these that if they weren't solid bone, I imagine they would just get pulverized. Some of the larger ones, like the pelican, and then the shoebill and some others, they do have holes throughout them, and they do look more like the sort of spongy bone that you would see throughout the bodies of birds. So I think, again, that's probably an effective scaling and how large the birds are. Every woodpecker that we looked at looks kind of similar to that hairy woodpecker one that we saw, where the shaft of the bones are actually sort of cupped and curved around. So there's a hollow area, and then they have struts of bone throughout. And we're not 100% sure on how that has an effect on their hearing. And that's for the next part of this study, as we start to really identify structures on the bones that we can score or classify across all the birds. Then we can start to see how those fine structures have an effect on energy transfer or sound transfer across the middle ear. You're muted again, sorry.
Okay. Do you plan to use any homologous landmarking approaches with your finer scale imaging?
Yes, we do. So what we're hoping is, one of the things we can do with the OCT is similar to CT imaging, is we can overlay sort of 3D meshes around those structures that can give us fine scale mapping across it. And then we're doing sort of old school morphology as well, where John and I are looking at every single bone under an optical microscope, and we're coming up with about 16 different landmarks and features that we can score in every single one of the species. And that'll help us understand how more of these finer structures have an effect on bird hearing.
Okay. Do you think birds get tinnitus?
There is some evidence that they do, but it might be short-lived. So we're not 100% sure.
Okay. Have you looked at the relationship of the pitch of a bird's song to the structure of its ear bones?
That is one of the things that we looked at. So those higher frequency sounds, right, those are higher pitched sounds. And so we see that the structure of those ear bones, of course, it's the smaller ear bones that are more finely tuned for those high frequency sounds, those higher pitched sounds. And so that is completely reasonable. It's what we expected, but exactly how some of the other structures affect hearing is what we hope to answer in the future.
Okay. This may relate to that. Have you looked at the relationship of the pitch of a bird's song to the structure of its ear bones?
That's, yeah, very, very, that answer would apply for that as well.
When we listened to the recordings of bird sounds, we were amazed by how much more complex sounds birds were hearing than we were hearing. How do they hear so fast? Well, we do know that the hearing centers in their brains work at a much faster rate than ours do. It's very similar to their eyesight. So it's kind of like a bird looking at us thinks we're constantly moving in slow motion. And that is just because of how well their eyes are working and how they maneuver through their environments. They have to be able to process sight at a much faster rate. And we know that that's very similar to how their brains are functioning for hearing. It's almost as, we're slowed down compared to them. Most birds, we seem like we're always lethargic and we're talking in slow motion. You say wanting to understand birds as hearing creatures, not just singing and calling. Do you think it has something more to do with alerts and mating, like say for a bird to enjoy, in quotes, a sound like humans appreciate music?
Absolutely. And I mean, we do also understand that bird calls, right, bird calls and bird songs function at different frequencies, depending on how effectively that message needs to be transferred. So we understand that they're able to hear those signals, of course, but we understand that calls are often, right, transmitted in a frequency and at a decibel to travel the greatest distance and be most effective. So if these are warning calls against a predator, song is generally not to be transmitted at great a distance and with as much, so with, I guess, with as much, pressing need. And then contact calls between young and adults are often delivered at very soft decibels and at a frequency that is not going to travel far to alert predators to where young might be. And so we understand that's how song is functioning, and calls are functioning outside. So yes to that, absolutely.
Do birds cock their heads to hear better or to see better, or both?
They do both. So like barn owls, so they're cocking their head and turning their head to pinpoint location. Bird ears, they're generally located, back here on their heads, and they definitely will turn their heads to hear, because the sound hitting those auricular feathers and the eardrum, it's more effective if it's hitting it at more of a right angle, of course. So they are turning their heads to hear sounds. But we do know, and one of the things I didn't talk about in songbirds, for example, in passeriforms that we see, there's also external morphology of their ear that doesn't get captured by the work that I presented. They have bony flaps that come over their ear holes. So passeriform ears are really oriented forward, right? So your warblers, your sparrows, and they have ear holes that are geared forward. And that's probably because of their, of their sight, and they want to hear exactly what they're looking at because they have very keen eyesight. And so it's probably their hearing is, it's evolved in conjunction with the use of sight in their life as well.
Would the feathers covering their ears affect sounds coming in?
They do. Work has shown that those feathers that cover the ears, they actually dampen the sounds because the eardrum and or the tympanic membrane and the middle ear and inner ear are extremely good conductors, that the sound is actually diminished by those feathers, and they can move them depending on what the decibel level of the sound might be or the frequency, to let more sound through and let less sound through. So soft sounds, they can actually move their auricular feathers to hear better as well. So there's definitely behavior around that aspect of hearing as well.
Okay, and this will probably be our last one. Are there birds you want to study but have not received a cadaver? What birds would those be?
Absolutely. There are birds that we would love to study. And we don't have a gannet. And we actually are working with a researcher in South Africa who studies gannet diving behavior and the impact it has on the bird's physiology. And so we're hoping to get gannets. We would like to get more cormorants, diversity of cormorants, and we would love to get our hands on some albatrosses as well, because it changes in pressure with flight and other things. And we would love to get members from every order and every family we could. So
Well,
I know we really want to do a lot. But it's fun work. So
well, thank you so much, Garth, for a most interesting program, one that I'm sure that provoked a lot of questions, certainly, as we've seen. And I think a final comment from one of our viewers is interesting. It says, super interesting. How do you explain your research at a cocktail party or a kid's soccer game?
well, it's not too hard. My middle school, he loves this work. He likes to look at the bones under a microscope, and he thinks it's pretty interesting. But yeah, it's hard to explain at a cocktail party that you're studying bird ears. Mhm.
Well, thank you so much. What an interesting program, Garth. Thanks for once again being our speaker.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. I had a great time.